So now we're going to take a look at Chapter 5, the part of Chapter 5 you're not going to use for your assignment number 1, but will be included in quiz number 1. And again, Chapter 5 focuses on cognitive development in infants and toddlers. So the Bailey scale of infant development is a commonly used assessment tool to determine physical and cognitive development in infants and toddlers. And it measures attention, it measures habituation, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It measures visual memory, imitation, problem solving, and language skills. So now we're going to take a look at a theory that doesn't have steps and stages, so it's a continuous theory. But its focus is more on the effects of the environment, even though capacities are important, biological capacities, environment is a little bit more important than that. And that's information processing theory. And remember that information processing theory looks at human development in relationship to computers. And so with a computer, in order for the computer to pay attention, we have to press the on button. Well, in human development, we have to in order to turn on our cognitive abilities, we need to pay attention. Attention is the focusing of our mental resources. It improves cognitive processing for many tasks. If we're not paying attention, it's not going to make as much impact on our cognitive development or cognitive processes. And at any one time, children, like adults, can pay attention to only a limited amount of information at a time. So attention is divided up or allocated in different ways. There's selective attention, which focuses on a specific relevant aspect of experience while ignoring those that are irrelevant. For example, focusing on an object that you're really interested in an environment and not paying attention to maybe music playing in the background. Divided attention is concentrating on more than one activity at the same time. So with divided attention, if you're manipulating an object, but then you're also paying attention to sounds like music, that would be divided attention. When it comes to infants, a concept called habituation comes into effect when we talk about their attention. If they are very familiar with something in their environment, whether it's a behavior or an object or a person, in habituation, they become less responsive, and they decrease their attention to a certain kind of stimulus after repeated presentations of that stimulus because it becomes familiar. They're really interested in what is new. Dishabituation is coming into contact with something that's new that they don't know a lot about. And so this is recovery of a habituated response after a change in stimulation. So infants' attention is so strongly governed by novelty and habituation that when an object becomes familiar, their attention becomes shorter, making them more vulnerable to distractions. So they have a shorter attention span, in other words. So there are a couple of types of memory that come into play for infants and toddlers. There's implicit memory, which is memory of skills and routine procedures that are performed automatically, such as riding a bicycle. And for infants, that might be possibly batting at something that's moving in front of them. Explicit memory is measured by deferred imitation. This is improvements likely due to brain development. And so they just remember something that happened in the past, and then they repeat that. So some examples of information processing tasks would be memory, as we just mentioned. For infants and toddlers, they have visual recognition memory, and they're able to imitate actions that someone else does. Compared to an 11-year-old, they can recognize abstract objects that maybe don't exist in real life and recall faces named in photos. Processing speed is another aspect. For infants and toddlers, they need time to orient to a stimulus, whereas an 11-year-old, they can time to touch one of several windows lighting up on a screen. And so they can do more sophisticated tasks. For attention, for infants and toddlers, number of shifts in looks between stimulus and in a memory task. And so that can determine dishabituation or habituation. And then for 11-year-olds, detecting when certain numbers occur in a long sequence. And then also representational competence, recognizing a shape visually that was felt by hand movements before. And so that's an accomplishment at the infant-toddler level, whereas for 11-year-olds, recognizing a three-dimensional shape felt by their hand previously. So those are some examples of information processing tasks by age. So categories in information processing allow infants to organize the world, and habituation is used to study the development of categorization skills in infants. And the speed with which infants habituate to new stimuli appears related to later intelligence and achievement in regards to reading and math scores. So infants begin forming categories around perceptual features such as physical appearance, and spoken words help infants determine stimuli that fit into different categories. And by 14 months, infants can clearly use conceptual categories. During the first 12 months, infants develop the ability to perceive units of sound and words in sentences. And so they're recognizing how language is organized. By 2 days of age, infants prefer listening to native language, and they can distinguish between unfamiliar languages. Because remember, they can hear in the last trimester of prenatal development. And so even though they're just born 2 days, they've heard a lot of language already. To understand language, infants segment speech into words. They identify repetitive sounds that appear together. They use intonation and stress in language. And sometimes they'll practice this with words that they make up themselves, and they use that intonation and stresses in something called jargon. So it sounds like they're saying a sentence or asking a question, but they're not using words that are understandable. Parents use simple language to communicate with infants, and we have a special name for that. and it's infant-directed speech, or IDS, and that features shorter sentences, more clearly articulated words, repeated words and phrases, higher and more variable pitch, and so even adults with very deep voices will raise the pitch of their voice because infants hear that sound better, although we don't do that intentionally. It's something that's genetically programmed. Imitation of infant speech by parents, and exaggerated stress and animation, or exaggerated behavior related to speech. And so those are all components of infant-directed speech. Also, joint attention is utilized in both cognitive and language development. So usually this begins to show up by about 9 months, where the infant is looking where adults are looking, and they also try to initiate the adult looking where they're looking. So this reflects the infant's understanding that others have goals and objectives, and it's a connection between joint attention and language development. And so around 9 months, language development speeds up. So there are a couple of theories of language development specifically. The behavioralist, B.F. Skinner, says that language is something that we reinforce or we recognize, and we give them positive reinforcement or something that they want, and they imitate. But this aspect itself doesn't explain how infants learn grammar. Noam Chomsky, who is a linguist, has a theory he calls the language acquisition device, or LAD, and in this theory he says that the brain is hardwired to acquire language, and there are specific areas of the brain focused on this aspect of development as well. So let's look at the many areas of the brain that are involved in language. And so for sure, the auditory cortex on the right is going to make a difference. And in regards to joint attention and body language, the visual cortex, on the bottom right, and then the face area for facial recognition, sort of in the center. Then we have the amygdala, which helps with emotions. And then if we kind of go way up to the top, the prefrontal cortex, that's problem solving and decision making area of the brain. So these all work together with receptive and expressive language. So in infancy and toddlerhood, this is a very sensitive period for language development, and we know that from case studies. And remember, we talked about case studies in the section of Chapter 1 on research. Abusive situations where children were deprived of the opportunity to listen to or use language. And there is a case study of a child named Jeannie who actually lived in Los Angeles, who was kept in a closet as a child abusively and was not allowed to speak, to use language, or was not offered the opportunity to hear language. And so later she was rescued and that opportunity was provided for her, but she never developed the ability to use syntax or grammar beyond the level of an average 2-year-old. So this is a period where you can do some intervention, but you can't completely catch up. So when a child is deaf, families have decisions to make about whether they want to focus specifically on sign language. And sign language, even if a child is not taught sign language, they'll develop their own version of sign language. And today, we also have a program called Baby Signs that can help infants communicate with signs that they may not be able to communicate verbally yet. But another issue with a child who's hearing impaired or deaf is that they may also, the family may want to encourage the development of some sort of oral skills rather than just on sign language, and sometimes families decide to focus on both. So there are mechanisms that for learning syntax may have more limited period of pruning and consolidation, and mechanisms for vocabulary may remain plastic throughout the lifespan. So remember, with plastic, they're more adaptable and flexible. So that may be part of why in the case of the Genie case study, syntax was an issue that we weren't able to intervene on.